So we're going to talk about the hired and non-owned exposure for the home care industry. But just before I get into an example associated directly with hired non-owned auto, I wanted to just differentiate between the two. Some people are not familiar with the hired non-owned auto, but they're familiar with a business-owned auto. Well, we're not going to talk about the business-owned auto today. It's obvious. If you have a vehicle that's titled in the company name, that's your business auto. Hired and non-owned auto is associated with liabilities connected with your caregivers on the road, your caregivers driving client vehicles. And so when an incident occurs on the road, your caregivers insurance goes first. This is why it's important that our providers are checking insurance for their staff as they're onboarding. And then in a claim scenario, the coverage on the caregiver's vehicle goes first, and then this hired and non-owned auto is the limits that are over and above the caregiver's limits, and that's why it's there. It's so important. And the example that I think could really hit home for these guys, we put together. There's so many, but the one specifically, we have a lot of situations where a provider allows their staff to drive the client vehicle. How many situations are it where the client vehicle looks a little bit safer or a little bit better condition, and you've got that Malibu in the garage that has 5,000 miles on it, so the client may want the caregiver to drive that vehicle. Sounds like a reasonable solution for a lot of these providers, but here's a realistic situation. You have a caregiver that comes to a client's home and they want to go to the doctor's office, but the vehicle in the driveway is an F-150, Miriam, and that caregiver who drove to work that day in her Toyota Prius is asked to drive that F-150 to the doctor's office. Is that a comfortable transition? Do you see the difference in the size of that vehicle versus what she's acclimated to? You're not in a safe situation. You're not in a comfortable atmosphere when you have that large of a shift going from one size vehicle to another. There's a lot of stringencies that carriers have put on insurance companies in the last several years because of the increase of claims in this area. It's huge the last several years.
Yeah, well, one interesting thing that I get a lot of times about is an owner will call in and say, well, I'd rather have them drive the client's vehicle, and a lot of people don't even realize, as a rule of thumb, coverage goes with the vehicle. So the client will say, yeah, I want you to drive my client vehicle, not realizing that they're now taking on that risk. The other thing is there's been a large crackdown of personal insurers on vehicles that will not extend coverage to that person if you don't tell them. So there's some hoops you have to jump through where you want to go back to the client and the client's family. If that's your solution is the client's vehicle, they actually need to go to their insurer and request permission and get a letter and all this other stuff. But I really discourage that because you're going to lose the client over it, right? The client's going to assume, even I've been on a call before with an owner and the client in that almost exact situation where he wanted to drive his larger vehicle while the caregiver driving it. And we explained to him a couple of times, like, you're taking the risk on for this, even with this letter, and he still insisted, well, if something happens, of course, I'm going to go back to the home care owner to make it right. And it's like, that's not how this works. So you want to discourage that. But the hired non-owned, there's case law out there now where you're seeing caregivers driving from their home to the client, get in a bad accident, and it comes back to the business. You really want to have that hired non-owned there to protect yourself. Even if it's a 1099 employee, we just had a client go through this in Florida where I said, well, I'm safe because it was 1099 and she got in a bad accident. It's not going to come back on me. I took that attorney 30 minutes to figure out, no, you really were driving in due course from that home care agency. We're going to take this to court. And they ultimately won. Now, luckily, they had the hired non-owned in place, and that did cover for the claim. But you really have to be careful out there. And, that's why carriers are asking more questions. Check MBRs, check insurance records, at least annually on your caregivers.
A lot of people don't know what MVRs are.
Yeah.
So the motor vehicle records are so important. And whether we're talking about the liability exposure and workers' comp carriers also are very, very in tune with motor vehicle record checks. And what a great way to just further peel back the onion on the screening process with your employees and really dive into what exposures are really there with somebody. Do I want to place this particular caregiver who's amazing with staff or amazing with clients? Do I want to place her with this client that requires a little bit more transportation each week versus another client that does not have any requirements for transportation or running errands? The other thing with a motor vehicle check, if the things that are on this record, Miriam, are so important, and you can't find this information elsewhere. Let's say that there's an individual that has a restricted driver's license where they can't drive past 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
Is that going to determine how you staff that individual?
Yeah.
How else do you know? Like it's on, there's so much information that's on here that is helpful to how you staff somebody, and that further decreases your risk when you're able to properly staff somebody.
Yeah, people get in car accidents, and if you've got a lot of caregivers out on the road, their fault or not, an accident's going to happen. You want to protect your business and your assets. Any concern with driver, all the distracted driving,
cell phones.
Yeah, make sure you have a no cell phone use policy when they're driving. Little things like that, have it in the handbook. When you bring them in for their safety training, remind them, no
tailgating.
Yeah, no tailgating, no cell phone use. All those types of things can really be a benefit.
And it goes back to front of mind too, just like we were talking about with the workers' comp, these things it's obvious to not drive with your cell phone and answering the phone calls and texting. It's obvious that we're not supposed to tailgate, but as we're rushing or as we're doing our everyday life, we forget these things that are so important. And so this reiteration, this practice of making these matters front of mind are an investment in a company, and they're necessary.